Welcome to my build log on Deviant 300. This is one of my own gliders and it's a rudderless build. And of course, since this is a rudderless build, there's not going to be a rudder, it's a rudderless fin. For servos, I'm going to be using the KST X06. These are the smallest servos available from KST right now, and they're just phenomenal for 1 meter. There's nothing else like it on the market. The hardware that comes with the X06 looks really similar to the ones that comes with the X08, but they're a little bit different. So I marked the bags on the X06s just to make sure I don't mix them up. So let's go over some of the tools that I'm going to be using. A lot of these are going to be linked down in the description box below, and they're very, very useful for any DLG build. Now let's take a quick look at the hardware that comes with the Deviant kit. Now keep in mind again that this is a rudderless build. That's why the servo tray only has space for 3 servos and we don't have a rudder horn. So let's work on the tails first. First, let's put some masking tape on the elevator so we know where to cut the slot for the control horn. And then we're going to use the cutting mat as a guide to draw the center line for where the control horn is going to be. I'm just using the control horn to check the thickness of the line to know how much I have to cut for the slot. And then I'm going to draw the position of the slot. Now the front of the slot is going to be 1 millimeter away from the hinge line. I always measure twice and cut once. Well, we probably should have done this at the beginning of the build, but I'm just using a Dremel to rough up the edges of all the different control horns. So that includes both the wing aileron control horns as well as the elevator control horn. This helps the glue have a better bite with the control horn when it's glued in. And then I'm going to clean it up with some rubbing alcohol. Using the metal ruler as a guide, I start cutting out the slot for the control horn. Because we're only cutting the top skin, we're going to do it with a very, very gentle pressure. This way, you're not going to accidentally poke all the way through and cut the bottom skin as well. It's really useful to change the blade often. They're quite cheap and it really does make everything a lot easier. With the sharp blade, you get a lot more control over the cuts, so everything comes out a lot cleaner. There's 2 ways to cut the slot for the control horn on the elevator. Because it's so thin, you can either just cut a single slot and then widen it with a small file, or in my case, I'm just cutting the overall slot with the knife. So in this case, a sharp knife really does make a difference. Once the top layer of the carbon is cut, just peel it off and then you can expose the foam. Make sure that the foam is cut all the way to the bottom skin and then you can start picking it out. I peel off the tape and then I do a test fitting with the control horn just to make sure that everything fits properly. Now in this case, it was a little bit tight, so we need to widen and extend the slot slightly so that everything fits in properly. Like with any joint, you want it to be as snug as possible, so that way you don't have to rely on glue to fill any gaps. Okay, so everything fits well now. So the next thing we need to do is make sure that the control horn is perpendicular to the surface of the elevator. I apply thin CA with the applicator tips that we sell. This gives you very fine control on where the CA is going to be applied. Now I'm going to add CA on both sides of the control horn Just keep adding a drop or two of the thin CA until it won't soak in anymore, so that we have a very strong bond. Make any last minute adjustments as necessary, and then hit it with kicker. Then I double check everything to make sure everything is good. Note the fillet around the control horn. Next, we're going to install the spring, and the overall length is 90 millimeters. Each leg is going to be 15 millimeters, so let's go ahead and bend those two legs. The bend should be 90 degrees. Let's measure up the other side, also 15 millimeters, and bend that as well. The end result should have both legs pointing in the same direction as you see above in the video. I'm poking a hole for the first leg of the spring right near the control horn so that the force from the spring can transfer directly to the control horn and not warp the surface. This is important. Make sure you didn't poke through the skin by accident. Let's take a look at where the second hole needs to be positioned and drill that out as well. Let's do a test fit and make sure everything fits together properly. Again, check to make sure you didn't poke through the skin by mistake. Okay, so everything looks good. Now let's get ready to glue it. To glue the springs, we're going to use white Gorilla Glue. It's an expanding foam glue. So it helps fill any potential voids in the foam that might have been caused when you were poking in the spring. And that really helps spread out the load over a larger surface. This just gives you a nicer finish since the spring won't poke itself against the skin. Now that you've applied glue to the legs, just poke the spring back into the tail surface. There's a little bit of excess glue, so let's wipe those off. Since this is a rudderless build, we're not going to have to do this for the rudder, but if you had a rudder, it would be the exact same process as the elevator shown here. Now that's it, just put it aside and let the glue cure. Next up, we're going to work on the wings. So similar to the elevator, we're going to start by masking off the areas where the control horns need to go. I have the edge of the tape basically right at the very edge of the aileron. This helps make alignment much easier later. I draw the hinge line on the tape, so it gives me an easier reference point. The control horns sit 1 millimeter away from the edge of the flaperon, so let's measure that out first. The control horn also sits 1 millimeter from the hinge line, so let's mark that as well. Next, we use the control horn as a reference to mark the thickness of the slot we need to cut. I'm just double checking the measurement and making sure the front of the control horn is 1 millimeter from the hinge line. Then I use the control horn to mark the rear of the slot. Now let's just repeat that on the other side. Just like the elevator, we're only cutting the top skin, so we don't want to accidentally cut all the way through to the bottom as well. Just cut with a new blade and gentle pressure. I find it's easier to get a good result by cutting the edge closer to the end of the flaperon first. You might notice that it's a bit harder to cut the skin closer to the hinge. That's because there's a Kevlar hinge under the carbon skin. Take your time and don't rush it. After that is done, I then cut the edge further from the end of the flaperon. Cut the short ends of the slot. Next, peel off the top layer of the carbon to expose the foam underneath. Cut through the foam with a knife, but be gentle so you don't cut the bottom skin. Once you're done, pick out the foam from the slot. Peel off the tape and test fit the control horn. Remember, I highly recommend cutting it slightly undersized and expand it with a file if necessary. You want to have a nice, snug fit. Perfect, so this side is done. Now all we need to do is repeat the same process on the other side. I discovered a small problem during the test fit. The slot is too close to the hinge, so I double checked the measurements and extended the slot slightly so that the control horn can be installed in the correct position. Once I'm happy with everything, I clean the surfaces with rubbing alcohol again. Next, I remove the tape that's been holding the flaperons in position. We need to be able to move the flaperons later when we start gluing the control horns. Mount the wing onto the fuselage with the supplied screws. Before I put the control horns into the wing, I clean them with rubbing alcohol one last time to make sure there's no oils or dust on the surface that might prevent a secure bond. Install the control horns and double check their positions. Make sure they're fully seated into the slots. If you're viewing the model from the front and the model is level, the control horns should be vertical and not perpendicular to the wing. This helps keep the control horns tight and flush against the fuselage. For now, I'm only adding thin CA to the outside edge of the control horns to hold their positions. Then, hit it with kicker. Repeat the process on both control horns until thin CA no longer soaks into the joint. Remember, we're only adding thin CA to the outside edge for now. Once that is done, just flip the plane over and remove the wing from the fuselage. Stand the wing vertical and add more CA. Once it no longer wicks in, build up a small fillet around the control horn. Before gluing the inside edge of the control horn, deflect the flaperon slightly. This prevents the glue from potentially wicking through the flaperon cut and gluing the flaperon to the inside tab. It is a pain to get it that nice and pretty again if that happens. The next part is the throwing blade. We have a PDF template for the Deviant throwing blade installation. I'll link it down below. Make sure you print it out 1:1 with no scaling. Then proceed to mark the shape and position of the blade on the piece of tape to begin cutting. I begin drilling out the opening with a pointy burr bit. Remember, we're not trying to get a perfect fit with the Dremel. It just needs to be close enough and slightly undersized. I switch over from the pointy bit to a small diameter bit as I near the edges so that the edges are vertical and not at an angle. Peel off the tape and finish off the hole with the hand files. Test fit and repeat as necessary until you have a nice, tight fit. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, a nice snug fit will be much stronger and more reliable. A loose fit filled with glue would break sooner or later. Now that I'm finished sanding the wingtip, I clean everything with rubbing alcohol again. Using a ball end, I lightly grind away the top layer of epoxy and paint at the center of the throwing blade where it joins with the wingtip. This will give us a better bond. But be careful, don't go too deep and start removing carbon. Once I'm happy with it, I clean everything with rubbing alcohol again and prepare to insert it into the wingtip. Once I fit the blade into the wingtip, I check to make sure that it's perpendicular to the wing when viewing it from the front and the side. I wick in thin CA from the top. I don't put too much CA at this point yet because I don't want any excess to start dripping down the blade. Then I hit it with kicker. I flip the wing over and soak in CA from the bottom. This time I can put more since the other side has already been cured. If there is any excess CA, it won't go past the wingtip and start dripping from the bottom of the blade. Wick in CA, hit with kicker, and repeat until a nice fillet is formed. Flip the wing over and create a fillet as well. Since this is a 1 meter model, I just use a CA fillet and not a reinforced epoxy fillet like my 1.5 meter models. That's the first part of my build. If you enjoyed it or found it useful, please hit like and subscribe so you don't miss part 2 next week. See you next time.